Mic test. Mic test 1 2. Mic test 1 2. Mic test 1 2. No? Mic test 1 2.
Are we good? We're ready? Good morning. Welcome. For those who don't know me, my name is Kevin White. I'm the pastor of Calvin Presbyterian Church in Cumberland, Rhode Island. I also co-chair our Presbyterian's anti-racism team. So welcome this morning. We're going to get started, and to get us started, I'm going to invite Reverend Do-Hoon Kim, who's the pastor here of New Haven Korean Church, just to come up and give us a little orientation of the space.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming here. On behalf of the entire New Haven Korean Church, I would like to express my warm gratitude and welcoming to you. Thank you so much. Yeah, you're going to have the first lecture here. After that, you're going to have the small group meeting. You pass the four small rooms, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see the number there. During your small group meeting, we're going to prepare tables for your lunch here. And then after your discussion, please come here again for your lunch. For your lunch, New Haven Korean Church would like to serve with some small food. Not only just American food, sandwich, but also Korean food. Do you like it? So we're gonna prepare the japchae, which is a special noodle with the vegetables, and also gimbap. That means black seaweed wrapping rice, vegetables. It's worldwide popular nowadays. And then some cookies and desserts today. So we would like to happily serve you today. So please enjoy it and have a wonderful training event today. Thank you so much. Oh, by the way, after lunch, please go up to a sanctuary area for your lecture. Not here, okay? Okay, thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. It's good to, thank you. It's great to come back from sabbatical and have your first day back be such a fabulous day and a fabulous event, bringing so many different things together. Thank you so much, Pastor Do-Hoon and the church, for welcoming us and for hosting us today. We're really grateful and honored to be here in your space and to be bringing the presbytery here. The ministry of this church is really we have fantastic ministries all over the presbytery, but I'm so grateful for the ministry of this church. Last year, we were able to celebrate the ordination of Rachel Park to Ministry of Word and Sacrament, which was the first Korean clergywoman to be ordained in this presbytery. And I just want to acknowledge the ministry of this church in making that very historic day happen. So thank you so much, Do-Hoon, and your session for that. Rachel is now down in your neck of the woods, William, in Atlanta, working on her PhD at the Candler School. So you'll get to meet her, I'm sure, which is wonderful. I also want to thank Nancy Basile and Kevin White, who are the co-chairs of our anti-racism and equity team of the Presbytery. They worked tirelessly to put this event together, and the whole team did. And who's on that team? If you could just stand up so we can recognize you. Thank you so much to our fantastic team for all of your work. My co-leader, the Reverend Kate Carlisle, is not here. Kate got sick over the last 2 days and so is not here, so we surround Kate with our prayers. They will be fine, but sorry that Kate is not here. So for that workshop, you're just gonna get me. It's not me and Kate, so I hope you'll still come and chat. I also want to welcome our friends who are here from Boston Presbytery. We've been doing more and more things over the last few years with our friends in Boston Presbytery, and we have a bunch of folks here. Ivy, are you still moderator? So the moderator of Boston Presbytery is here. Welcome. So we're so glad to have you here with us, and we look forward to lots of partnerships in New England coming together. I think that's going to be the theme as we go into the next couple years. This is the time. So we're so happy that all of you are here. We also have some friends here, I think, from the UCC, who's sort of like kind of a Presbyterian, kind of a UCCer, but I just want to say, like, we got ecumenical. I just want to say, okay. Riley, thank you for coming. It's so good to see you. I also want to say, during my sabbatical, I was really grateful to have one of my good friends and colleagues, the Reverend David Bennett, fill in as the sabbatical presbyter, I think we called you. We just make up names. But David filled in. David's here, if you haven't met him, if you saw him mostly on Zoom during my sabbatical, but David's here. David's the stated clerk in Albany Presbytery. And also, Reverend Dr. Amari Tanyon Santos is here. Amari is in specialized ministry in Albany Presbytery. So we've got kind of a gathering of the synod going on a little bit here today. So welcome to both of you. Thank you, David, for holding things together while I was on sabbatical. I left and I didn't worry about hardly anything at all, so that was great. It's great to be here with all of you. I especially want to welcome Dr. Yu to being here. I first met William a couple years ago at the Stony Point Center. I was serving as co-chair of the Mission Agency Board, which of course is now gone in the unification process of the PCUSA. We'll talk about that another day. That's a whole other conversation. But we had William come to the Stony Point Center when his first book launched to come and speak with us about it. We really thought that his book, which was just getting published at that time, was really important for the PCUSA. And we wanted to give all of the energy that we had as the Mission Agency Board, and the press tends to follow us around at our meetings. So we were sort of strategically pushing the book out into the denomination by inviting Dr. Yu. And he came and we had a 2-day teach-in on all of the research and the themes and the history behind your book, What Kind of Christianity? And it really was, we had a great 2 days. And then William, you came and you spoke at the Matthew 25 Summit a little over a year ago in Atlanta for the denomination, for the whole denomination. And you've been going around and doing a whole bunch of other conversations. So we're so happy to have you here for our first official anti-racism and equity training. We've been doing work on anti-racism as a presbytery for a number of years, but this is our first official all-presbytery training. So officially, Reverend Dr. William Yu, Presbyterian, one of us, is Associate Professor of American Religious and Cultural History at Columbia Theological Seminary. He's published books on African American Christianity, Asian American Christianity, and Presbyterian history, including the very important book, What Kind of Christianity? A History of Slavery and Anti-Black Racism in the Presbyterian Church, which was the winner of the 2023 Award of Excellence from the Religion Communicators Council. He is a teacher at Columbia Theological Seminary, a preacher, a scholar, and is focused on the history of racism in American Christianity. A professor and public theologian who interprets and challenges some of the most urgent issues of our day with clarity, depth, honest, and passion, and I will also say a very healthy dose of humor to go alongside with all of it. So William, I'm so glad to be with you again. We seem to be making this an annual thing, so we'll continue in 2026 with another annual gathering. We'll have to figure out what that is. I'm so grateful to welcome you to the Presbytery of Southern New England and to be here with all of us today. Welcome, Dr. Yu.
We got our roll call. It's nice to be with you all today. My name is Reverend Nancy Basile. I'm the co-chair of the Anti-Racism and Equity team in this presbytery. And I'd like to take this time and privilege to pause and acknowledge the land that we are using today. We are a presbytery who is struggling and striving to find our way through what it means to be people who descended from colonizers, who have taken land that was not ours to take, and who use it for our benefit, for resources, and our own livelihoods now. We stand on this land with reverence and honor, and also with the humility as we recognize that action is more important than anything else at this time. So please hear me as we acknowledge that Indigenous peoples and nations, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Skagatoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded the land that we are on today through generations, and that the lands and waterways of where we stand are now called the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship between these peoples and this land, and we seek to reverently discern our way forward in restoring a sense of honor to this land.
Let us pray. Gracious and merciful God, we gather today from near and far, seeking your wisdom and guidance as we engage in this anti-racism training. Please be present among us, Lord. Open our hearts and minds so that we may recognize and confront the injustice that divide us. Grant us the courage to stand against discrimination in all its forms, and the wisdom to lead with love, humility, and justice. Lord, we confess that we have not always lived according to your commandment to love one another. We have allowed selfishness and pride to blind us, failing to fully embrace the dignity of our neighbors. We acknowledge the Church's past and present shortcomings in addressing injustice. Forgive us, Lord. Cleanse our hearts, humble our spirits, and renew in us a deep commitment to your will. As we learn and reflect today, give us ears to hear, eyes to see, and hearts to understand. Help us to listen with humility, speak with grace, and act with conviction. Let this training not be just a moment of learning, but the beginning of real transformation in our lives, our churches, and our communities. We also lift up those who have worked to bring us together today. Bless them with joy and strength. May every conversation, every lesson, and every step we take bring glory to you and draw us closer to the vision of justice and love you have set before us. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ, who calls us to be peacemakers and bearers of your truth. Amen.
Good morning, everyone. I think we'll all rise if you're able to open up with our morning hymn today. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart. Not be all else to me.
grateful to New Haven Korean Church, grateful to the pastors who I've been in communication with before today, Pastors Shannon, Nancy, Kevin, and Pastor Toon Kim, the senior minister here at New Haven Korean Presbyterian. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, if we can switch the slides over to the ones that I have prepared. So I have a few things that are on my heart and mind in thinking about anti-racism training and racial justice. So I will start with a emerging thesis, and I know, big word, I don't really mean for it to be, perhaps like awareness that, so throughout the history of Christianity, let's say in this country, and I don't mean to say that it only exists in this country, certainly it does not, but as something that I can say with more clarity and depth, because it's something that I study. I do think one ongoing struggle in American Christianity has certainly been the relationship between individual and society, or person and community. And I think of this roughly 100 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that. There was a group of Christian women and men that came to be known as social gospelers, if you will, Washington Gladden in Ohio, Walter Rauschenbusch here in New York, and even thinking about the Catholic social gospel, Dorothy Day as well. I think their conviction, for example, Walter Rauschenbusch in a theology of the social gospel, his conviction was that certainly Christianity and the message and the gospel of Jesus Christ is for individual salvation. There's something that happens in the spirituality of a person. But Walter Rauschenbusch also argued that it is also about social reform. If you will, and I'll use this paraphrasing him, certainly he affirmed ministries that were convicted and passionate about getting souls to heaven. But he also said, in addition to that, it is also about bringing heaven onto earth. It is looking at poverty and oppression in local communities and all across the nation and thinking, how can we make our earth look more and more like heaven? And that this required social reform. It did require Christians engaging, tackling, and grappling with larger systemic or social issues in one's community. So that the social gospel was about both individual salvation and social reform, both evangelism and mission, if you will. Of course, the challenge in American Christianity is, I think Walter Rauschenbusch's both and, if you will, have been taken as either or in a lot of communities. That Christianity is either about individual salvation or about social reform. And this is an ongoing challenge. And I think for many Christians who are now increasingly committed to anti-racism and racial justice, I think there is a lot of progress. The history that I'm going to share with you in a few moments, it is deflating and it is humbling. But I think also we can find clarity and hope in it. I will say a generation ago, perhaps, one of the great challenges, even in a presbytery such as like this one and in our denomination, is the reluctance to talk about racism. So many of the sermons, for example, from both black and white clergy and the civil rights movement were things about, we need to talk about it. We need to preach about race, because there was an absence of preaching about it. I do think there's progress in that. Less, I think now, again, I don't want to overstate it, but we are talking about it more and more. Preachers and pastors are preaching about it. Sessions are deliberating about it and discerning and praying about it more directly. So I think the next challenge for us is that we're talking about it now. How do we talk better about it? How do we talk about it in ways that give concrete hope to people? How do we talk about it in ways that really mobilize and gather and energize people of faith to do good in their local communities, in their churches? Because sometimes what's happening is we're talking about it, but we're fighting about it. And some of the fight is okay, because there are going to be some disagreements. But a lot of times, I do find over the past several years, it has devolved into things that are not as helpful. So now, long story short, here's my kind of thesis, if you will. I do think if one of the critiques of, let's say, more conservative or evangelical Christianity, I don't mean to get on a soapbox about it, writ large, is that perhaps there's an overemphasis on individualism rather than community. I do find across several Christian communities, when thinking about anti-racism, I have that same critique, that it actually overemphasizes individualism and interpersonal racism at the expense of, if you will, thinking about what congregations can do, what we need to do in local communities, and what to do in our nation. I do think there is a place to do some introspective work and to think about, for example, there have been several studies to think about, and books, to think about white fragility and white privilege, and to think about whiteness and how to work through that. But I do think that that is actually a small piece of a larger puzzle and challenge. So that I despair when 80% of our time is spent on that 20%, thinking about whiteness and what it means to be white, or what it means to be a person of color. That is important, that's a good foundation. But ultimately, it is how individuals can work together in congregations and civically being involved in one communities to tackle racism and to get at racially just witness and action. So that's something that I've certainly been wrestling with. And then after lunch, I do want to talk a little bit more about how do we move from ministries of guilt and shame, which I find are actually not that helpful, to ministries of responsibility and repair. But for now, I do want to talk a little bit about this history. If you can go to the next slide, please. So that's a book that I just wrote that came out, and some of what I'll share is from that. But I do want to share while being here at New Haven Korean Church. So I enrolled, I guess, in my PhD program in 2009, and I finished in 2014. And knowing that I was in an American kind of religious history program, what comes up is, you're always asked this when you're in it, is what are you going to write your dissertation about? What's your research question? Do you have a good, they call it the elevator talk. Can you talk about it quickly from ground floor up to the 5th floor and tell someone what it's about? So for me, it was throughout. I said, as someone who is wanting to be a church historian, and hopefully will get to teach somewhere to get to do this, I said I'm really interested in origin stories. I really want to understand who I am and where I came from. And I find history very helpful for that. Not in an overly determinative, fatalistic way, but it helps. It provides information and illumination that helps me understand who I am, where I came from, and where I need to go. So I said my first project is I do want to understand more what it means to be a Korean American Christian, because that's deeply forming me. And I will say some of my advisors at Emory, a university in Atlanta where I was doing my PhD, I think they affirmed the project, but back then, this was 15, 16 years ago, they said maybe that's a later project, because they were, again, not in any immoral or bad way, but they were just thinking of the academic marketplace. They were thinking our main goal for William is certainly we want him to do good research, but we also want him to land a job in a declining academic marketplace. So we'd like for him to write about something that has some kind of broad resonance, and something that also has the opportunity to land with easy to publish. Dissertations are not easy to publish because they are narrow and they are specialized topics. And I said, I do get all that, but I said, you know what? I only have one shot at this. Who knows? You're saying that could be a good second or third book. I don't know that I have a second or third book in me. Right now, I'm a young father with little kids, and I don't know what's going to happen after this, so might as well, if I only get one book and one shot, might as well write the thing that's deepest on my heart. And thankfully, what happened by 2014 and now is that the academic marketplace did change, that there was more openness and willingness to learn about different stories, Asian American, global Christianity, all these different kind of stories. So it did kind of work out. So I wrote this book, you can see it there, looking really at the partnerships and power struggles between probably the first 2 generations of American white missionaries, Methodist and Presbyterian largely actually Presbyterian, in the Korean peninsula before it was North and South Korea, and early Korean church leaders, and how they worked together in kind of planting churches and preaching the gospel in Korea. And what I will say, if you can go to the next slide, it is for me, I find, and this was a lesson for me that I took with me, it was a history that was simultaneously inspiring and infuriating. And that's when I realized that's what church history should be. But that's not the church history I got. I got a lot of the first, very little of the second, right? I got kind of sanitized or like smaller histories because there was concern. We want church history to inspire, to spur on people of faith to good deeds and, action and the like. So to get at the messiness and the complexity of it, there's a concern in seminary classrooms, Christian college classrooms, and of course then Sunday school classrooms in local congregations. If you learn too much of all of it, it will really deflate and it will really confuse more than inspire and spur on, right? That's from the book of Hebrews, towards love and good deeds. But I said, you know what? And here's a picture on the left. It's from a missionary magazine, pan-denominational one, and it's a letter you'll see from Samuel Moffat, who was one of the first pioneer missionaries, originally in Seoul and then went to Pyongyang. And one thing to note about a lot of these first missionaries is that they were young white men and women, like in their 20s and early 30s. And of course, what drove them to Korea, this little then unknown country, it was really seen as the desirable, and I hate to talk about this, but I'm just going to use that language, like mission places, right? It's a weird thing to say because these are nations. But certainly there was something about Japan, because Japan was rising in geopolitical influence, and there was more even in the United States, and some of it is bad, that Orientalism and the fascination with, but it was this idea that there's a lot of opportunity in Japan as it grows open to westernization and modernization and the like, to go there. And of course, China was this big country with a long history in East Asia. And then there was then to them this little kind of unknown, it was actually called the Hermit Kingdom nation, this Korea that was not as open to Western like interaction and just kind of there. So that the missionaries who went to Korea, they were kind of like the pioneer, the young, scrappy, and hungry, to use a line from Hamilton, missionaries that really wanted to go to somewhere new, go somewhere unknown, and to really make a mark. And of course, much of it was zeal for Christ and good. But of course, there was some righteousness, and there was some self-righteousness. And I think that's part of what it is to be a pioneer and brave to go there. So Samuel Moffat, I think a McCormick grad, went to Seoul, and he realized, it was like 1900, there are missionaries already there, and they were fighting some. They were fighting some about approach. Do we do medical work first, educational work? Because again, in Korea then in the 1880s, 1890s, there was some suspicion about foreign religion. And there was even a welcome for missionaries to come to do medical work, but there were some tight restrictions early on until probably 1891, 1892. They got there in 1884, 1885 on evangelism. So you had these two missionaries, Horace Underwood and Horace Allen. Again, these young men. One, Allen the doctor, Underwood the missionary. And they actually didn't get along at all, because Allen was like the doctor, and he was like, look, the king, the royal, they've given us permission to start this hospital, and so let's do good work. And the missionaries, you can come help me, but you can't come in here and keep evangelizing directly to all the patients. And I think part of it, and this was happening all in East Asia, and it was a wrestle between some of the medical missionaries, if you will. So some of them were like, it's good, let's do it all. Like if we bring in a patient, let's heal the whole person, body, mind, and soul, and the like. But other doctors were like, look, we're foreigners, we look strange to them with our strange hair, and they always said with our long noses and the like, and we're here. And people who come to the hospital are sick. They're at their most vulnerable. Perhaps this is not the time where we compel them to learn about what to them is a new religion. Perhaps through our actions and our deeds, there will come a time. Let's not do that here. And so that was a debate. And also, Underwood as a missionary, like Moffat, they got their Masters of Divinity. They were preachers. They weren't here just to like teach English and help out with what they can at the hospital. They were here to preach the gospel. So some of them were impatient and they wanted to go. So Moffat got there and he saw that there was some fighting going on. So he said, I'm going to go to Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea, because there's less established there. I can really do my own thing, or for God. And it really did flourish there. Now it's in Seoul, South Korea, the largest Presbyterian seminary and Christian college from the Presbyterian Church of Korea. Its roots are really in Pyongyang and with Moffat. Moffat is the founder. And I've been there. I know, Reverend Kim, you've been there too. It is kind of odd that there is actually a pretty large statue for Samuel Moffat, and then like there are smaller ones for Luther and Calvin right next to him. Like these very well-known early modern European reformers. They got these little statues. And then this man that generally most people, Americans, don't know has this large statue. But that's there, and those are the first 7 teaching elders or ministers of word and sacrament in the Presbyterian Church of Korea from 1907. And then this other picture is a picture from Missionary Magazine that really shows like I guess they call it the mission station or mission compound, all that was going on there. And ultimately, it is kind of beautiful. There's a hospital, there's Sunday school, there are educational schools, job training, and the like. But I begin this book, and what I found was in 1925, one of those first 7 Korean ministers, the Reverend Seokjin Han, or Han Seokjin in Korean, they met. They had this big missionary conference I think it was in Seoul, so they traveled down. And Reverend Han was good friends with Reverend Moffat. They had, first it was teacher-pupil and then partner. And then at this meeting, what Reverend Han told Reverend Moffat, is ultimately if the Korean church is going to grow, we have to do it ourselves with our own leaders. This is 100 years ago. And that will require the missionaries to leave so that we can get out of this paternalistic relationship. And then he looked at Moffat and he said, even you, Reverend Moffat, even you have to go eventually if we're going to build our own church. And of course, that was certainly very hard for Moffat. He had worked so hard, and in 1934, so that means he didn't really listen to him, so he was still there. But it was a larger point of looking at, like, how do we still do partnership together and that power struggle? And ultimately, what happened in Korea is actually, and it was really through geopolitics and war and communism and the Korean War and the like. Ultimately, the Korean church did grow and become its own thing and its own ministry, if you will, actually long after the missionaries had left. Really, the growth of, for example, Korean Protestantism comes after 1950, after 1960, when missionary presence was not what it was beforehand. And I think that's true everywhere, right? That it's when local leaders, discern the movement of the Spirit for themselves, where things really grow and flourish. But with that, so that was kind of where I was. And then next slide, please. I know I'm going too long on this little intro. I got to move here. So after that origin story, I said, what's the next origin story I want to write? And some of you may know I've talked about this some. So really, I set out in 2018 with Westminster John Knox Press, part of the Presbyterian Publishing Corporation. I said, I want to write a history of racism in American Presbyterianism, because I really want to understand it. I want to understand how a tradition, all the good and the bad, like what the striving has been, but I want to also understand why it's been so hard, why we haven't made more progress. And so I said I'm going to set out to write this book, and ultimately what I came to find is that at one level, slavery is central to this story. But what I also found is that I found myself very dissatisfied with the treatments of slavery and all the other history books that I was reading. And in part, I noticed, one is that when you only devote a chapter to it, like 30, 40 pages, you can't really get at the depth of what it was. But secondly, I found actually that I disagreed, and increasingly, like angrily and vehemently, with the interpretations. The interpretations that isolated and highlighted that the problem of slavery in the Presbyterian Church, capital C, was biblical interpretation. That it was a disagreement between pro-slavery biblical literalists and these kind of radical, progressive abolitionists who were reading the Bible like differently. And so the problem was this biblical interpretation. If only those pro-slavery pastors and theologians, if only they had access to the biblical tools and the later developments in modern biblical critical interpretation, then perhaps the implicit thing is it might have been different. And I found that that's not true at all. Really, it was that the conditions and the world that they had inherited, that slavery for them, for example, in the 1830s, began long before them. But it was the world that they inhabited, the social, racial, political, cultural, economic forces of slavery. These things were not divorced from their minds when they prayed and they read their Bible and made their interpretation. It wasn't like, we call it like a hermeneutical vacuum that they interpreted, right? It was that they brought all that in to how they were interpreting the Bible and how they were practicing Presbyterian Christianity and churches, polity, and everything and the like. And I would say the same thing was true of the abolitionists. They too had this wicked world that they had inherited and they had inhabited, and certainly when they opened the Bible, they too read the Bible. So one Frederick Ross, he was a Tennessee white pastor in the 1850s. He said, you abolitionists, you're twisting and manipulating the Bible with your agenda. You are turning the Bible into an abolition Bible, and you are turning God into an abolition God. It is because you are reading the scripture through the lenses of abolition. And at one level, actually, I find that he was right. But the larger point is that everyone was reading the Bible through the lenses of slavery and abolition. Of course, because they were trying to make sense of what was happening through the Word of God. And so what I find is that, and one of my arguments in this book is that Presbyterianism and the Reformed tradition in of themselves were not the problem. Presbyterians and Reformed believers, some of them, I don't want to say all of them, they were the problem. What I mean by that is that there is nothing inherent in the Reformed tradition and in Presbyterian polity and how we do things that lean toward being oppressive and lean toward supporting slavery. What it was that they found what they needed in the Bible and the Reformed tradition, picking the parts that they wanted to support anti-black racism and slavery. So the picture you see on the other side there is that one of the ways I make the case is that the American Anti-Slavery Society, founded in 1833 by William Lloyd Garrison and several other abolitionists. It was the largest and first kind of nationwide national abolitionist organization, the AASS. And this is a picture of a page from their first annual report in 1834. And this is the executive committee. And what you'll see there, and what I found is that 6 of the 12 men, and they were all men until 1840, when actually William Lloyd Garrison and some of the men supported some women to be elected to the executive committee. And that actually separated the AASS. And so right after that meeting in 1840, some of the men, including some of the men on this exec committee here, they actually left and I think went to like another church or another building like across the street, and they founded the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. So there was the AASS and the AFASS. And there were these 2 large things. It's like the party planning committee and committee to plan parties for a minute if you've watched The Office. But far more serious. So initially, though, there were these 12 men. And my point in this book, and just thinking through the lens of Presbyterianism, I know for sure, and it might be more, that 6 of these 12 men were Presbyterian. So certainly, they found in Presbyterianism, and they found in Presbyterian interpretations of Scripture and in the Reformed tradition, they found the hope, the inspiration, and quite frankly, the ammunition they needed to fight against slavery. Theodore S. Wright and Samuel Eli Cornish, 2 black New York City ministers. They're right there. They're 2 of the 12 on the exec committee. Arthur and Lewis Tappan, 2 wealthy New York businessmen and ruling elders and a Presbyterian congregation in New York City, white men. They're on this committee. Samuel Cox, a New York City pastor, and John Rankin in Ripley, Ohio, one of the real heroes of the Underground Railroad. His home is honored, him and his spouse, Jean Lowry Rankin. The Rankin House was one of the sites of the Underground Railroad where they housed formerly enslaved people who were seeking freedom, many of whom were making their way to Canada. So all of that is there. So then, so I find there that there's a lot of hope, even in, again, but I think we have to, it's infuriating because I also share that none of these men were very influential in the abolitionist movement. They had very little influence on no executive committees in the larger Presbyterian church. They were far more influential outside of Presbyterianism than within it, because the larger church did not want those foundational shakeups and disruptions that these kind of men and also later women were a part of. So that is part of the story. So now I'm going to get to sharing some today about making of Christianity in southern New England. If you can go to the next slide, please. I think I got a few. So this is the larger history of the book. So I'm not gonna read that since that's there, but I do want to talk about three people, and oh gosh, I'm maybe two people for now because of time. But one of the people I want to talk about, and I also write some about her in the last book, What Kind of Christianity, is this individuals were actually quite fascinated with this, to them, odd yet noble, like experiment of democracy. Democracy was not a thing in Western Europe in the 1820s, but it was a thing, and they wanted to see what's it really like in the United States. So she too, in 1834, after kind of getting acclaim as an economic writer in England, so she came to the United States for roughly maybe a year and a half, and she published in 1837 an account of her insights that became quite well known and actually helped even launch her career to higher status. And so she writes about how she came to Massachusetts, and she participated in several public events in the 1830s. And she wrote about how odd it was for her to meet white residents who honored the quote-unquote Pilgrim Fathers, in her words, and celebrated how these ancestors colonized indigenous territory that now formed their predominantly white commonwealth. In the town of Plymouth, Martineau attended the annual Forefathers Day festival, which happens, I still think, every December, celebrating the initial arrival of the Mayflower English ship on Wampanoag land in 1620. As she approached Pilgrim Hall Museum, at this point, when she came, it was in the 10th year of existence, the historical portrait that awaited visitors staggered Martineau. And she writes, quote, "Samoset, the Indian chief, is advancing with English words of greeting. Welcome, Englishmen. Elder Brewster and other fathers with their apprehensive wives and wandering children form an excellent group, and the Mayflower is seen moored in the distance," end quote. The English sociologist Martineau found it curious that white Americans did not allow for even a moment to grapple with a history that resulted in the very indigenous tribes and nations that once inhabited all the lands across their nation. Instead, white Americans, according to Martineau, reveled in the revisionist histories they chose to tell themselves. And she wrote in this book, quote, "I felt as if in a dream the whole time that I was wandering about the rejoicing people, among the traces of the heroic men and women who came over into the perilous wilderness in search of freedom and worship," end quote. Throughout the time, she just reflected on all of this, and later she says, quote, "Then occurs the question about the Indians," talking about indigenous peoples. "Where are they?" And the answer leaves one less sympathy than one would wish to have with the present security of the settler, end quote. The orations that were delivered at civic gatherings, such as Forefathers Day, also left Martineau, and here she didn't spare words, disgusted was her word. The speakers, who were often local politicians, but also clergy persons, did not inspire, in Martineau's view, their listeners toward responsible civic participation. But instead, they spoke tawdry tales of half-truths and downright falsehoods. The first problem Martineau identified was speech-making that fell to the prey of, quote, "the prostitution of moral sentiment and the claptrap of praise and pathos," end quote. Yet I think what was important for me, and I hope important for us, is the second ailment that Martineau observed or prescribed. It was a misestimation of the American people. Martineau contended that the orators treated their listeners with even less regard than parents hold for their youngest children, because they perpetuated perpetuated the notion that most Americans could not engage complex ideas about their history, their society, and their nation. And I do think we are still wrestling with that too. I do think Martineau's point there is to note, certainly, that there has been a lot of good that came from the Pilgrims and the Puritans, but that there was also, obviously in her mind in the 1830s, a lot of bad. And it was apparent to her, certainly because there were still populations, though smaller, of indigenous nations that resided in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I'll get to in a minute, states such as Connecticut and Rhode Island. And so what she observed is that the indigenous peoples are still here, and they are still oppressed, and what they are seeking is coexistence. How can we productively, effectively coexist with now this predominantly white population in these states, in our ancestral land? And so for Martineau, she said, that is a complex thing, and figuring that out is not easy. That's something she argued, and then I'll get to it in a minute, slavery, but that is something the American people, including people of faith, do need to discern and wrestle with together. So rather than the claptrap of praise and pathos in her words, in addition to that, certainly we need a little inspiration, but we need to really engage complex ideas that will require complex solutions for these pressing racial and social injustices. Yet her despair was that she simply did not see the appetite for that among the American public, and also, and I'll get to it in a minute, among American churches. One component of American Protestantism that Martineau found admirable was the rise of voluntary churches in the United States. De Tocqueville also wrote about this and several others. These European observers, they were actually quite gobsmacked and amazed that churches in the United States and the early American Republic were flourishing and growing without state support, without taxpayer funds. That was something that was unheard of in Western Europe. The idea that churches could be voluntary organizations that are self-sustaining and self-supporting by the contributions, the tithes and offerings of church people. And so she said, this is quite amazing. She and many others, that Christianity in the United States, apart from state support, is actually growing. And it is something that, unlike Western Europe, where eventually some of the class revolutions, if you will, such as in France, were simultaneously anti-state, but also, and I think some of you may know this word, anti-clericalism. They were against both church and state, and even the Marxist movement in Europe really saw the connection and the power of church and state as something to oppose. Whereas in the United States, churches actually had a pretty incarnational nature. That certainly some churches where elite, wealthy people lived, those churches kind of looked like elite, wealthy neighborhoods. It sounded like that, ministers talked like that, the people worshiped there, it looked like that. Yet, for example, rural country churches with middling class people, they didn't look like the established big high steeple churches. They looked and took the form, and preachers preached in a way that really connected with people. One of the most famous ministers, I don't write about him, was this, in this time period, 1830s, 40s, was this Methodist minister named Lorenzo Dow, who was an itinerant traveling minister who spoke in like plain spoken ways, who didn't read from manuscripts, but really like grabbed people and even criticized Calvinism. What did he say? You can and you can't, or you will or you won't. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. That's Calvinism. He says something just like that, right? But it was amazing. So Martineau noted that it was really like that Christianity in the United States was both elite and common people, that it really was diverse, and it really did take on like the flesh of lots of different forms. But she did say one of the challenges there is because pastors and churches relied on voluntary offerings and contributions. She did say that she found and believed that it was difficult for pastors to preach fully and freely from their consciences and convictions. Quote, the American clergy being absolved from the common clerical vices of ambition and cupidity, which she said that's the criticism of the Church of England, where she was from. It remains to be seen whether they are free also from that of the idolatry of opinion. So she was quite good about it. She has this phrase, clergy compensation in the United States, unlike in the Church of England, it takes the form of small salaries and large presents. And what she noted with that, when she thought about the reluctance of most white clergy to preach on supporting the abolitionist movement, she said, it's not like monetary greed that is the motivation behind this, in her mind, resounding silence. But she said and thought that the scarcity of bold preaching was simply due to a desire that many clergy wanted to maintain their modest livelihoods working as a pastor. It wasn't that these pastors wanted so much money. It's these pastors simply wanted to have the little bit of money that they were receiving to do God's work in ministry. Yet, I will say, and I was a little bit surprised by this, Martineau, she didn't absolve these pastors for their moral failings. She asserted that pastors were, quote, the most backward and timid class in the society in which they live, because too many clergy, and these are my words, compromise their holy vocations when refusing to raise, and I'm going back to Martineau's words, what may be disturbing questions before their people. And she noted that how can you get at change? How can you get rid of this system of slavery that pervades across the United States if preachers won't preach about it and people of faith won't talk about it? Whether in congregations, and these are my words, civic gatherings or everyday conversations, there existed in the United States of the 1830s, according to Martineau and many other people, a troubling aversion which sometimes evolved into an implacable hostility toward addressing the pervasive sins of settler colonialism and slavery. And so this is the world and church that we have inherited and that we inhabit. Next slide, please. And I'm going to say one more thing here before. And so you can see there where I'm going with the book and kind of what I'd like to talk to you about later on this afternoon, just because we're out of time here. It is to note at what I will say, and I'll close with this, is that I believe a better and fuller understanding of this history need not be fatalistic and need not be lead us to despair. I think rather than despair, I would love to see more clarity and humility. And rather than guilt and shame, I would want to see more motivation for better understanding our past, better understanding where we came from, so that we can identify some of our challenges today with precision and work toward dismantling some of what's hard. Again, so what are ways in which we can talk better about anti-racism and racial justice in churches and in our communities of faith today? I do think, and I'll end with one observation that I am working toward, and it's from an old book that some of you may know and some of you may have read from 1989. And I share with the young students at my seminary. We don't have as many as we used to, but they get it right away. I say, this is the second best thing that came out of 1989. And they're like, Taylor Swift, that's the first. But Stanley Hauerwas and William Willimon, these two Duke Divinity School professors, talking together, hanging out, they decided we're going to write a book together called Resident Aliens, how to be a Christian colony in the United States. And they just write about how to be countercultural and the like. And one of the things they observe, and they were, I think, prophetic in this way, they said, what's amazing is that, I forget the start, but essentially it was they noted in South Carolina that other things were opening up on Sunday morning, other activities were taking place. And they were like, this is something that was unheard of. The church worship service was like a monopoly. Nothing else could happen on Sunday morning except for church. But they said other stuff is happening, like plays and civic meetings, and people are actually going to them. Now for us, it's that's just pretty normative. But they said that's okay. And they were saying the church was never supposed to be in lockstep with the culture. The church was always supposed to be countercultural. So they make this argument, and they say churches do need to be political. But they need to be political in the sense of speaking to the whole of what's happening in society and in one civic community. And so that churches should not sound exactly like either the loudest voices on the political right or the political left. that churches need to have and speak with a distinctive theological voice that brings a perspective from the gospel and from the Christian tradition that cuts through and helps people better understand what of the loudest voices, if anything, is good and true and useful, whether it be on the right or the left. And I found that really helpful, their observation that it shouldn't mimic. That churches, it is. I don't think churches should sound just like the loudest voices. For a church that's center right, it should not sound like the loudest voices and the politicians and the podcasts that are popular among the right. Nor should churches that are lean left, center left, sound exactly like what is happening on podcasts or, for example, Representatives Jasmine Crockett and AOC. That churches certainly, if they resonate with some of what they're saying, but it shouldn't be the same thing. There should be something that we're speaking about and talking about in the church that at one level rises above, because we have the gospel, but not in like a triumphalistic we're better than way, but also in a way that like helps people understand, here's how we're going to think about like systemic racism. Here's how we're going to think about some of the challenges, the deepest challenges that we're facing in our community. And I hope that's the hope. And for me, so I don't know that I have a distinctive theological voice, but I do think, I hope I have a historical perspective that also neither sounds like the loudest voices on the left or right, but that simply wants to say, here's where we came from. Here's where we are today. And I do believe genuinely, here's how we can do better. That it is really possible, that all things are possible for those of us who believe in faith and work together. And ultimately, because it's not your work or mine or your table or mine. It is God's work and God's table, and God has called us to participate in it. So I'll end there. It's 11:04. I'm sorry to the organizers, and I'm sorry I didn't even get to, thanks for the folks in the back helping out, but I'll talk some more about the other stuff later. So that's it, Kevin. No. We can do like 5 minutes of Q&A, maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then do small groups. I don't think I should get into the other figures because that's.
Somebody asked him about the other figures. Okay. What about the other figures? Yeah. So we're gonna take a few minutes for some questions and answers. So are there anybody have any questions? Anything percolating up that you want to ask? Maybe a question about history in Southern New England. Scott.
Oh, yeah, thank you, sir. That's a great question. So actually, do you mind going to my last slide? I can actually, 2 birds in 1 stone. I'm gonna take that hard question and try to make it into something. So I do. I think, so this is, I wish everyone knew more about him. He's actually got a lot of Connecticut roots. He is recognized as the first black student at Yale Divinity School, James W.C. Pennington. Never got a degree there because of racism that existed, and I think Yale Divinity School has honored him in seeking to repair and make amends. But he was a formerly enslaved man who escaped slavery in Eastern Maryland, James W.C. Pennington, and became an abolitionist. Actually, was the officiant for Frederick Douglass's first marriage after Frederick Douglass had escaped slavery himself from Baltimore. But Congregational and Presbyterian pastor. And he went to a conference in Paris and he spoke. This is what he said in 1849. He did say, in thinking about clarity and humility, he did recognize, and you can see it there, like, how does one like be a faithful Christian but also be a fervent patriot, love of nation? So what he did say is that like national love and love of nation is not inherently a bad thing. America, the United States, is becoming a great nation. Frederick Douglass said this is himself as well. He said the problem is it has become a great nation that continues to oppress like indigenous and black people, that it is not a great nation for all. And how do we do that? But he did say, and you can see it there, that it's a blessing to have a country and it is a virtue to love it. But this love of country, American exceptionalism, if you will, is also capable of great abuse. And so he did note, like, how do you, like, even test patriotism and balance it with the call of the gospel? And for him it was, and you can see it there, immutable justice of God, and reminding that people of every nationality, every race, and every ethnicity share one common humanity. So that it is possible to say, I love the United States, and I love being a part of the American story. And I do, as a eldest son of Korean immigrants who came to this country in the 1970s. But how do I temper that and balance that with the call of the gospel? How do I recognize that patriotism is both vice and virtue to faith, which was something that I think Pennington realized. And I think for him, as a formerly enslaved black man who was still experiencing racial oppression, while recognizing the good and the opportunities that he had in New York, Connecticut, it was this balance. And I think that's where clarity and humility come from. It is to say, I do think the United States is an exceptional country. Do I think it's a perfect country? Certainly not. But I do think it's possible to hold those ideals and those practices in what I would say is in productive tension. And what I mean by that, and maybe it's more circular, it's in constant movement. It's not fixed in the sense of it's always one or the other. But it is constantly, in the same way our faith and the movement of the Spirit, it's constantly challenging me and affirming me and growing, and I'm learning more and just figuring out how to do this well, and how to really honor God, honor country, and honor humanity and creation and God. And I think that's kind of the conversation we can keep having. For example, and I'll end this, even on immigration, it is to recognize that this side of heaven, we do not live in a borderless world. We do live in a nation states. It's really hard. I think Reinhold Niebuhr, the ethicist, theological ethicist from Union Seminary in New York, after many years of being a pastor and kind of working with working class folks in Detroit, he did say, it is possible for individuals, moral man, I think that's his argument, to really exhibit the love of Christ and self-sacrifice. But it is impossible for nations to do that. Immoral society, moral man, immoral, I think that's the name of the book. In part because nations are inherently driven by self-interest. That nations have economic and military factors and considerations that they always have to consider. It's politics, he says, it's the cruel world of trying to seek justice in a messy world. That it is inherently messy and hard. And so when we think about immigration, it is how do we work towards securing borders, and how do we work toward just and fair and faithful processes for screening and for immigration to happen for opportunity, while also being careful not to dehumanize the migrants and the refugees and the vulnerable in our midst. I think it is possible to support, for example, more restrictive immigration policies, maybe not the most draconian ones, but it is possible to have positions, political, legal positions that say, ultimately, perhaps we do need a few more restrictive policies because of challenges that are happening here, while at the same time not vilifying and not dehumanizing and not saying the awful things that one might say about people from different countries. And what is challenging for the United States on immigration, I'm sorry to get on this for a little bit, it is that I've studied this some, it's funny, right? I said, I'm going to write a book that's accessible, that really makes things as simple as possible about how do we really honor indigenous peoples well? How do we really get at what does repair and reparation for black people in this country look like? And then one chapter I have in mind is immigration. How do we do this well? What I found is that chapter is very hard to write because the United States has never had a coherent immigration policy, in part because of our settler colonial history. For example, the country where my parents came from, South Korea now, largely like many other countries outside of Western Europe and the United States, the immigration policy is largely driven by economic factors. Immigration is open to those who are willing to do the work no one else wants to do, and immigration is open to those who can do the work that no one else can do. It is what they call, and these are not the right terms, so I'm just using terms that are out there and even legal terms, low-skilled and high-skilled workers. Like, that's it. That is really what drives immigration policy. But the United States has always had this, maybe moral is not the right word, but aspirational component to our immigration. That we are open for the huddled masses, that the United States is a place for middle-class opportunity, not just for low skills and high skills, but for medium skills, if you will. And in part, that is because of the history of European immigration to this country. And even European descendant people and politicians and people of other nationalities and races and ethnicities too, no one really wants to kick the ladder behind them. Noting, because there are so many stories, that my family came to this country, not because they had high skills, but simply, but legally they came and they built a better lives for themselves and the future, and it also helped the economic prosperity of this country. There is that other component. And then there is this other component, and this is something in common with Western Europe, though it's not as like official. There are some moral obligations to several Caribbean and Latin American countries for the devastation that American imperialism has brought, for example, in the Northern Triangle. That's those countries in Central America, what is it, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Little differently from Western Europe, where it's like clearer, like why are there immigrants from Algeria in France, from the DRC, the Congo in Belgium? Part of it is, and when we see people, if you were visit there, you know some of it is because of the history of European imperialism in these countries. So there is a relationship in a sense. The United States actually also has that. But a lot of what our government, not you or me, but what our government did, for example, in the Northern Triangle, it was covert. It was like CIA, but it was terrible stuff. Terrible stuff that was very repressive, that led to revolutions, that even in the name of capitalism and democracy, really trampled down on socialist movements. Many of the people who come from the Northern Triangle, for example, are of indigenous descent, are indigenous, in part because these indigenous peoples in these countries were less open to kind of the economic order. Like, some of it is silly. It's even if you were just to Google United Fruit Company, like all for bananas, all of the devastation and the horror that happened. So the United States also does have some sense of responsibility for how to bring in the same way they did 100 years ago in the Philippines, which was for a season an American colony. And so they opened it up for a very few Filipinos to come. But it's a recognition that all of these things are part of immigration. And so that is what makes it challenging for us as a nation to have like a coherent, just, as moral as possible this side of heaven immigration policy. But that is really something that we need to work towards. And so that it is possible perhaps to support more restrictive immigration policies while supporting the immigrants who live among us in our midst. I don't think that is two-faced and the like. But I do think that requires, at one level, an awareness of history, of where we came from, but at another level, it does require people of faith, and this is work I think churches can do to help people understand. Here's how God wants us to understand what's happening in our midst, and here's ultimately also how God wants us to get civically involved and perhaps even politically involved. How can one do all of that, like with clarity and humility? Noting that, so that's one example of several of how we do these things. But it does require like working together and talking together. And it will also require like disagreeing. It will require, there will be some contention and there will be some tension on any issue that we talk about. And like being okay and hopefully maybe setting a covenant and ground rules that, hey, look, we're gonna talk about this, it's gonna get a little heated, but we're gonna agree to be together. We're not gonna dehumanize people, we're not gonna shout at one another, but we're really gonna figure it out and we're gonna really be open to questions. The last thing I'll say about that, and I'm increasingly, even some Christian legal folks, they are saying like, perhaps the United States really does need to reform its asylum policy, because asylum presents a clearer and faster pathway to citizenship than does the visa policy and other immigration policies. So the asylum policy is liable to more abuse. The asylum policy itself is vulnerable, and leads itself to bad actors trying to get in that way. And I think it's possible. I'm not fully persuaded by that position. I got to do a little more homework. But what I appreciate about that position from a Christian legal theorist is that it does not talk about people from other countries being less than, people from other countries wanting to take over this country and the like. But it really does wrestle with what is just and fair, and how do we get at policies that make sense and enhance the common good. But that also wrestle with the fact that we don't live in a borderless country. Not everyone who wants to come here can come. But what are ways that we can do it that really are humane and are good? I do think the United States is capable of that. Sadly, I don't know that the politics in Washington, D.C. right now are capable of that, so we got to hang in there. But I think it's capable for people of faith to talk about things and act about things in ways that really are helpful and productive, but also are hard. I think some of what I'm saying here, it is hard. It doesn't sound like I think what happens in some of our left and left of center churches that really do, in a way, good, celebrate the immigrant and the refugee in our midst. Well, and I too want to do that, but I also want to grapple with how does this work? How does this work for us as a finite country? Again, but in ways that are good and fair and just. And even then, how does reparation, how does black reparations, how does uplifting black communities, how does that work? What are the ways where it will really be good partnerships? So certainly what we are experiencing and what we know is that interracial, multiracial worship services are one part of it. But certainly I find that can't be the only part of it, that there have to be other good partnerships that take place. And for some churches, and I know I'm going on and on, I don't know if the goal is necessarily, one goal certainly, all our churches want to increase the diversity in our churches. We want to be open to all people because we believe in a big gospel and that God welcomes all. But another, I think, component for some churches, depending on context, that while having that goal, there also has to be a second goal of how do we support other Christian community and faith communities of color in our neighborhood and in our community. That the goal might not be that they all come to my church, but the goal is that I've got my church, and how do we support these other churches that are doing good ministry in our midst? So to not insist upon, if one is the stronger church with more material resources, that you always have to come to us a few times a year for this partnership to work. For us to really work together in ways that will help all, in ways that honor dignity and help support flourishing. So I think those are questions we have to have. Whereas I think a generation ago, even the churches that wanted to do racial diversity, I think that was the big thing. We're going to make our church look more diverse, maybe look more like our community. But I think another step churches can do is how do we make our community look more like heaven? How do we make our community be a place where there is more racial, social, cultural, economic, and religious flourishing? And that might not be 30 new people coming into my church every Sunday, but it might be some of us here going out to learn more and support more what's going on out there. I get it. A lot of people, when I talk to church people, they say, I don't want to just write a check. And I say, I don't want you to just write a check either. But I think you're going to have to write a check. In the sense of, I do think you're going to have to do some due diligence. And I think ultimately for some churches, that may well be the most faithful thing that God is calling you to do. So I don't want you to do it in ways that are like toxic charity, and I don't want you to do it without due diligence. But that might be maybe not the next step, but a next step in your ministry. But thanks. We're done with questions for now. I know people got to go.
Keep percolating some questions for later. So we're gonna take what time is it? 11:23. So we're gonna take a short break here in a moment to stretch. Anything you need to take care of for yourself, and then we're gonna move to our breakout sections. Just as a reminder, we had 4. So when you registered, you picked one. If you're looking at them and thinking, oh, I really don't want to go to the one I picked, I want to go to another one, that's fine. You can go to that other one. So I just want to run through those real quick as a reminder. Part of why we're doing this is our presbytery's new anti-racism policy about anti-racism training, and that comes because the Book of Order now, all councils of the church, so including church sessions, are to develop an anti-racism